Hi and welcome to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times. I'm Lana, Deputy Editor here. This episode is sponsored by MSA Safety. This time we're focusing on local leadership and devolution as Catherine speaks with Jo Coles, Deputy Mayor of York and North Yorkshire for Policing, Crime and Fire. So Jo took on the role in 2024 following the creation of a new combined authority for the region. It marked quite a big change in how public safety is governed locally, replacing the police, fire and crime commissioner model with a directly elected mayor and a deputy responsible for police and fire. It's still quite early days, but Catherine spoke to Jo about what's changed so far, what stayed the same, and then what it's been like stepping into a more publicly visible, politically accountable role. They talk about the practicalities of devolution, so from funding decisions and scrutiny to partnership working and prevention, and then also how Jo is navigating the balance between local priorities and national policy. There's also quite a timely discussion about the wider picture, so with several other areas now consulting on similar changes to police and fire governance. Jo shares her advice for those who might also be going down the same path, and why she believes that there is no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to public safety. So let's get into the conversation.
Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jo Coles, Deputy Mayor for York and North Yorkshire for Policing, Crime and Fire. Welcome to you, Jo.
Hi, nice to be here.
It's great to speak to you. We met briefly at the LGA Fire Conference earlier this year after you gave a great speech about devolution and how the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner for North Yorkshire had evolved with the creation of a combined authority mayor for the same area. So I think for me, the first question is, how did you come to be Deputy Mayor for Police and Fire before we find out why North Yorkshire now has a mayor?
So York and North Yorkshire had their election for their first ever directly elected mayor in May of last year. So the history to that was the county council in North Yorkshire had previously had 6 district borough councils, which became one unitary authority in 2023. And that was the precursor really to the launch of the combined authority and the mayoral elections, which took place in May of last year. And a couple of weeks after he was elected, David Scaith, who's the first elected mayor for York and North Yorkshire, approached me and asked whether I would be prepared to serve as his deputy. I am a City of York councillor, so I was on the council executive working on the brief for health and wellbeing and adult social care. So I came off that and I started as his deputy in July of last year.
Right. And so in that role, did you have experience of working with police and fire in various council roles?
Not directly, and certainly not as a councillor, but in my paid work, I'd worked in police and crime, in the police and crime world via public inquiries. Also, I'd worked in politics with politicians who were working in that sphere as well. So I understood the world, if you like, but this was a much more practical, hands-on role compared to the things that I'd done previously.
Yeah, so that's interesting, the idea of practical versus sort of policy and strategy. How do you as Deputy Mayor balance those two things out, about their day-to-day and then the big picture and what the Home Secretary is looking for at a sort of national level?
Exactly. So it's really just about trying to ensure that obviously my role is not operational. So that those are matters obviously for the police and fire service. Anything operational is a matter for them, but trying to ensure that I'm able to translate the things that are coming through nationally in terms of policy direction and strategic direction nationally, but how that's going to work in our place. So for me, devolution is all about things being able to work in your place for your people. The big difference in a devolved model is about, not wanting to have one model that works for everywhere. Actually, it should be slightly different in York and North Yorkshire to how it might be in another part of the country, because our geography is different, our people are different, and our services and how we need to deliver them will be slightly different. And for me, that's the beauty about working in a devolved function. We shouldn't be looking for it to be one way of doing things for everywhere. We should be happy for there to be slightly different ways of doing things in different places, because that's just, the beauty of a devolved model is it should work for your place and your circumstances.
Yes, and I suppose in terms of place, we think of it as a geographical area. Your area previously was a police, fire and crime commissioner area, so North Yorkshire. We had 5 PFCCs, and with you becoming a mayor, effectively 4 PFCCs and yourselves, and the first ones to go. So when you spoke at the LJ Fire Conference, you shared that experience with other councillors and you gave your presentation. I wonder if you could give us an essence of what it was you shared with those councillors that you thought would be most useful for them to know about that experience of going from PFCC to mayor, whereas many of them are still in maybe even county council, so miles away from it.
So I think not looking for there to be one way of doing things is the first thing I would say. Don't assume that just because we have done something in a particular way in York and North Yorkshire that would be the way that everyone should be doing things, because in Greater Manchester they will be doing things differently to us, and in West Yorkshire, where they currently still have a fire authority and a deputy mayor and a mayor, things are done very differently there. So don't try and assume that one model is the only way to do things. We are fortunate in terms of we've had significant coterminous geography. So we did, as you said, have one PFCC prior to David Scaife being elected as the mayor and then appointing me as his deputy with responsibility for police, fire and crime. That does make things easier, I think, but actually that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of doing it. There absolutely would be. I would say one of the big opportunities, if you like, is around partnership and collaboration. And so being able to think more widely about some of the drivers of crime, for example, or thinking about crime prevention or fire prevention, and what other partners you might need to be talking to in order to be able to move those things forward. I think there's probably slightly more we're probably slightly more dynamic in that space than perhaps a fire authority might be, because there's only me looking at this, albeit with my team. But actually that does mean that convening other partners is probably slightly easier than it would be potentially for a fire authority. But there's nothing, from my point of view, if people wanted to maintain a fire authority model, there's nothing wrong with that. And certainly for areas that have got more local authority partners, different local authorities. We've only got 2 local authorities across the mayoral combined authority, but in other areas they'll have many more than that. And I think it's about looking at what works for you, what delivers that democratic accountability, that is the link between the public and the services that are operating on their behalf, and just making sure that whatever your screening function, whatever your oversight that you have in terms of accountability, that works for your area.
Yes. Okay. So that's very clear on the sort of police and fire side of things. I wonder how resilience fits in, because in terms of your devolution settlement, it said that you'd have a leadership role for public safety, so that includes police and fire, but also a clear role in resilience as civil contingency planning, preparation and delivery. So in our emergency services world, we talk a lot about that wider picture of police, fire and ambulance. So how does that work at a practical level within your combined authority, how to deal with resilience?
So at the moment, most of that role will be fulfilled by officers. So they'd be the chief executive or the chief fire officer and the chief constable would be the people who will be leading on that. Certainly from my point of view, my role is much more around ensuring that we have the resources in those services to be able to deliver what the public need in order to be safe in their communities, asking the right questions, and looking at the budgets from that point of view as well. So I would say that would be my reassurance, but I would certainly say that there is scope to be much deeper in the way that you think about things, probably than there might be currently within the other models that other people will be working under.
Yes, and in terms of sort of bringing that to life for people, can you share any examples of the difference it's made to the delivery of public safety in North Yorkshire as a result of having a combined authority mayor? Is there a step change from that PFCC to yourself you talk a lot about place and partnership, and partnership certainly is a long-term thing within emergency services, but what difference does it make? Is there something you can kind of put your finger on and go, that's the difference, that's what difference I made?
So we're only 10 months in, and we only published our police and crime plans and our fire and rescue plans kind of a month ago, so just over a month ago. So it's still very early days in terms of actual delivery. I would say though that the difference is probably in a lot of that convening space and what the partners you're able to bring together around perhaps some wider objectives. So we've got a priority in the police and crime plan, for example, around early intervention and prevention. Now that is not it's in the police and crime plan. Prevention also sits in the fire and rescue plan. That isn't necessarily about those services on their own delivering those things, because actually prevention most of the time is about partnership and people understanding who's going to be the best agency in order to deliver that prevention. So if you were talking, for example, about vulnerable older people, of which we've got quite a lot in our rural areas in particular, so it would be about understanding with local authorities, for example, and their adult social care teams, the way in which the fire and rescue service can best support the work that they are doing to identify vulnerability, to ensure that those fire safety checks, for example, might be happening in those places. Now, some of these things will happen regardless of whether you have a mayor, a deputy mayor or model or a fire authority. But actually, it's much easier to convene those partners across a mayoral devolved infrastructure, because actually one of the things that we do have is we have a lot more focus. So there's a lot more attention being put on the areas with mayors, and that just means that there is a focal point that people like you are looking at this model and how it's working. It also means that the media is more interested in a way that perhaps it wouldn't be as interested in the fire authority model necessarily, and it just means that opportunity to bring partners together around some shared objectives, particularly those broader ones to do with public safety or prevention, it is much easier to convene those partners together and talk about how we kind of share our objectives and work together collaboratively without, in a world of, limited resources, when a lot of services are overstretched. Actually, how do we work to ensure that we're not losing sight of that prevention agenda?
Yes, and I suppose at the heart of that is data, how you're sharing the data from all those agencies to identify vulnerability, to make best use of your resources. Have you found, since you've come into this role, that data is an issue that bothers you? Does it come across your desk? What are you finding in terms of being able to deliver? Is it a blocker?
I think you're absolutely right that it's incredibly important, and I think ensuring that you have that single version of the truth, I think is really important. And I think one of the challenges is sometimes that everyone's focused on the data, but it's not always clear that everyone's data is exactly the same. So one of the things that we're trying to do is just establish some of those kind of baselines of what the truth actually is. Obviously, police data is generally public data, and it's certainly, we publish our police performance data in our online public meetings that we have every other month, same for fire, but then it's also about looking at working with partners around what their data is also saying, and again just making sure that works for your place. And I agree that sometimes that doesn't work smoothly straight away, but it is a really important way of bringing people together, because ultimately everyone in our public services is focused on making their communities safer and looking after the public. And, if we all accept that is our driving principle, then actually looking at how we can do that better by working in partnership with each other, then that will be much better. So, for example, today I've had a meeting about out of court disposals, and all those provisions to keep people out of the criminal justice system, but then also looking at, for example, what our drug and alcohol treatment pathways are like. That's not really for us to deliver as police and crime, in my role as police and crime, but actually need to work with health partners on some of those things in order to understand where their resources are stretched, what the drivers from policing are, that is taking up an awful lot of police time, a lot of repeat offenders going through a system. If they're not getting the support in terms of drug and alcohol treatment programs, that means that they're continually going through a criminal justice process, which is actually really impactful on resourcing in the criminal justice process, which we also know is incredibly stretched. So it's about trying to identify those elements, which again, I was doing that earlier today, that will help to just focus us on the wider community benefits and the wider community safety and wider public good, which we know ultimately all our public services are trying to deliver.
Yes, and it's interesting you mentioned the focus on the new model of, well, the relatively new model of devolved devolution and the combined authority mayors, and how it does shine the spotlight and it does gather interest from people like me. It's interesting that with that focus, obviously there is beyond your borders the devolution and how it affects other areas, and the white paper that came out with 4 consultation proposals for 4 different areas, finishing a consultation on the 13th of April. Those areas will see potentially police and crime commissioners and police, fire and crime commissioners be subsumed within new mayors if that goes ahead. I wondered if any of those existing PCCs, PFCCs had spoken to you about your experience directly and about what they're finding on the ground through this consultation process.
So in short, yes, we are talking more generally, actually, just in terms of there is an association of police and crime commissioners nationally. Yes. That is the coordinating body. They are absolutely very present in this space and are working to ensure that all the learning from the devolution processes that are kind of ongoing or underway or have taken place, that we're learning all the time from those processes, because there's no point in reinventing wheels and all the rest of it. We might as well learn the lessons from these processes, but it is still quite early days. And I think I would also slightly caution about, you want to learn lessons. What you don't want to set is a blueprint, because people should be able to do these things differently in their places. That's the whole point about devolution. There shouldn't be one way of doing this. So people should be able to have slightly different ways of doing that, which I certainly would advocate for, and certainly I haven't really had specific conversations with individuals in that space, but it is definitely an area that I know the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners is looking at very actively in terms of their support that they are providing to PCCs, PFCCs across the country, because even though there's those 4 going ahead now, there's a whole load of other parts of the country where this is just at a slightly different stage. Yes. So I feel quite fortunate to be at this stage in the process, but equally always really happy to help colleagues if they're not sure about what direction they should be going in. I would say you definitely learn lessons, but don't assume you have to do exactly what someone else is doing.
Yes, I think that's a useful piece of advice. And I wonder for those authorities which aren't the same as you, because you had this one glorious term we use a lot, coterminosity, so police and fire in the same space. But for some of these areas, so for instance in Norfolk and Suffolk, that's 2 counties coming together where the fire and rescue service is buried in the county. That's 2 police forces potentially coming under one combined authority mayor. That seems quite complex to achieve and to get to come out the other side. Do you have any advice for those people in terms of how they take that forward? Sounds quite tricky to me.
I mean, like I said, I would look at your place and what works for your place, and just ensure that what you're looking at in terms of a model is something that's going to work for your place. And I think it's really important not to lose a political narrative in that, but equally not to lose operational narrative either. So you need to get the balance between operationally what's practical and what's going to make sense, and also the politicians in that space will have their own opinions on that, and both of those things I would say are probably quite important.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond, shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
So let's move on to funding. So all about the money. One of the benefits of devolution is the freedom to spend money without the restrictions, in inverted commas, of Westminster. I know it's early days for you, but I wonder if there is more that you want to do but can't yet because of the limitations you have in your devolution settlement, or are there many great things that you're going to do and you're not too worried about that yet because it's so early and you've got lots to do? I wonder where you were in that space.
So it's definitely an important factor, I would have thought, in terms of driving people towards this model. It does give you some more flexibility. So certainly precept flexibility was incredibly important for us. So in York and North Yorkshire, one of the issues that we inherited, David Scaife, the mayor, and I inherited, was there had been a historic gap in fire funding. So we'd had a frozen precept. The precept had been frozen between 2011 and 2014. That had created a huge gap in the fire budget of about £21 million. That had been identified by the Police, Fire and Crime panel over successive years, but they hadn't been able to do anything about it because there wasn't precept flexibility. And so David and I, when we came in last summer, one of our early conversations was about the challenges in the fire budget, and because essentially all the efficiencies had already been driven through the system. And then one of the issues with fire is geography. You can't change your geography, so we still have to be able to put out fires everywhere in our region, and we are one of the largest geographical regions in the country. So therefore, actually, the economies of scale, if you like, were limited in terms of what we were going to be able to do. And actually, because it had been going on for over 10 years, actually all those efficiencies had been driven, and we were in a really precarious situation in terms of the fire funding. So we were in a position to act in that first year. So the first precept was a significant increase. So we did increase the fire precept by £24, which is only 50p a week. But actually, when people's budgets are really stretched, that was a significant percentage increase for people. But we felt that we had to do it because there had been that historic gap in the funding for the fire service. And it hopefully will mean that we're able to put the fire service in a much safer and more stable financial footing going forward to keep people safe in the region. So actually, in terms of finance, that flexibility is really useful. Our issue was with fire funding, but in other parts of the country, it might be with police funding. It might be with something else. You can use a mayoral precept to raise money for whatever you want. So I know in Greater Manchester, the mayor has used it to tackle homelessness, for example. The mayors, depending on what their devolution agreement says, can use those precepts flexibly to reflect a particular local challenge. So we looked at fire this year because it was in a really precarious state, but there is real scope for you to look at that through the lens of your place and decide what you think that priority needs to be to keep your communities safe, which is obviously, like I keep saying, was the priority and is the priority for everyone who's working in all of these services.
Yes, and in terms of telling that narrative to the people who are actually paying those bills, the extra £24, how did you present that as part of how come they're paying all this extra council tax for a fire service which had 10 years of not being able to sort it out? How do you tell that story?
Exactly like that. So we told the story of the context, so why it was happening in that way, the fact that actually it hadn't been possible to increase the precept by more than the maximum allowed by the government until there was a mayor in place, and then that obviously that we know that is a really difficult decision, and but it was the only way that we could put that service on a secure financial footing and get the investment into some of the equipment that the service absolutely needed to keep people safe after a very long period of underinvestment, because there'd been that hole in the budget. But we did it through public consultation, as you would expect, for a precept, and and then made the decision, which was then scrutinised by the Police, Fire and Crime panel, and was also kind of approved by them. But also recognising that same Police, Fire and Crime panel had been asking for an exception to be made for a number of years themselves. So it was, in some ways, it was the time to do it, because we knew that the Police, Fire and Crime panel was in the same place as us, and this was the thing that we needed to do to kind of protect the service.
And is that a one-off? Will it happen again
Hopefully,
next
yes.
year?
No,
Okay.
no. Hopefully it's a one-off. It was about filling the gap that had been created historically. But you never know, do you? You don't know what circumstances might happen in your region if you suddenly have a terribly dry summer full of wildfires across our moors and dales. I mean, you never know, do you? But equally, it's certainly no plan to do that on a regular basis. That was a big undertaking to do that this year.
Yes. So a normal fire authority would be, or local authority would be restricted. I think it's 5% that they could increase
Exactly.
council tax. But what you're saying is that you can increase it as much as you like, or
well, within what you think is palatable to the public. But our increase, I think I'm right in saying, might have been 24% this year. I'll double check that for you.
Because if you do that year on year, then the mayor doesn't look
29%.
So,
it was 29%.
Because that's not something you can do every year, because I'm not sure your electorate would like that very much.
No, but effectively what we were doing was, because it was frozen for 3 years, there was a historical gap. So people had, it's not the right way of saying it, but because the precept had been frozen for 3 years, there wasn't an increase at all for 3 years. So in some ways you're just kind of catching it up, albeit with one big increase in 1 year. I mean, it was a big percentage increase because it was 29%, but actually in cash terms, it was £24 on a Band D property, which is actually only 50 pence a week, because the fire proportion of precept is so small. But it does mean that we're able to plug that gap in that service.
Yes. Okay. You mentioned the Police, Fire and Crime panel as part of your response there, and that's the last bit we're going to look at in our chat this afternoon. So in terms of scrutiny and assurance, a Police, Fire and Crime panel would work scrutinise the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, but under a mayoral model, how does that work?
So it's very similar, except that because I've got the responsibilities for police, fire and crime are given to me. I oversee much of that scrutiny process in a lot of those meetings, but the mayor also attends some of those key panel meetings as well. So particularly around the precept, for example, and the police and fire and crime plans, those were quite important occasions for the mayor also to be present at panel. But in terms of the not monthly, however often it is, scrutiny, those regular scrutiny meetings, if it's just looking at thematic issues like we did this month, looking at rural violence against women and girls or rural crime, it's me that would go and answer panel questions and talk to those issues with panel.
And those members of the panel, are they drawn from the previous crime panel when it was under the? I think it's
broadly,
PSCC?
it's constituted. I don't think the constitution of the panel has changed.
Right. Okay. And in terms of the public, thinking about that scrutiny, thinking about yourself and your new role and the operational side of police and fire in your area, do you think anybody's noticed the difference? Does it feel like there's a step change overall, or is it quite a subtle, long journey, do you think, in terms of seeing a massive change from where we are now to where you want to be?
So there's two parts to that, really. One thing I would say is I do think the mayoral models are under more public attention. I do think they get a lot more public attention than perhaps the commissioner roles do, or maybe that's because I wasn't around during the commissioner role, so I'm noticing it more. But I do think the mayors, because they've got more of a national presence on the national stage as well, and because the government is very focused on devolution and the opportunities that to devolve support to mayors, that is probably an increase in terms of levels of public scrutiny. In terms of the actual practical public scrutiny, we are still carrying out online public meetings in the way that we did previously, with the fire chief and the chief constable, looking at the issues affecting the service, scrutinising them, the opportunity for the public to ask questions in those places. So all of that is carrying on as before. Then it's just about how you marry that with the, I think, increased public attention. But I think the increased public attention is as much around the wider economic opportunities from devolution in terms of economic growth, jobs, skills, housing, planning, those transport, those kind of issues that are combined authority issues. It's probably as much about that as it is about police, fire and crime now.
Yes. And my final question before I ask you to give us one piece of advice for our listeners at the end of this interview is around balance. So fire is smaller in many ways than police, budgets, number of officers and so forth. How do you, as Deputy Mayor, balance your time to make sure you're not spending too much of your time on police? How do you make sure that you give them the need and the time that they deserve, given how different they are in terms of their sizes?
So we, in terms of the frameworks that we're operating with, a lot of those are dual function. So a lot of shared services are dual across the two services. So I certainly wouldn't be siding in one place over the other, whether it was police or fire, particularly around that. I think we're also taking a kind of risk-based approach to a lot of it, so trying to make sure that we're focused on mitigating risks in both services, and that means being defined a little bit by where the risks are the highest in both of those both services. I don't think at the moment I would be that concerned that I was taking too much time with police or too little time with fire. I actually think probably the balance is about right, but probably one of the things that we should do when I'm perhaps a year in is actually evaluate that in a slightly more formal way in terms of how I've used my time. But yes. We're not yet a year in, so it's probably quite hard to say at the moment. But the impression that I have is not that I'm it's probably relatively well balanced between those two services. And also the role is slightly different with fire, because the fire service sits directly within the combined authority, whereas the police service obviously is much more at arm's length, and it's more of a scrutiny oversight role rather than it actually being part of the combined authority. So it's slightly different, but I wouldn't be concerned, but we haven't yet reached a point in the kind of cyclical process where we've actually analysed it. But my sense is that I'm not, but it will be useful to do that check at the end of a year.
So you've gone from being a City of York councillor, and you have other roles, but are you enjoying this transition? Has it been a good year for you? Is it something you kind of think, yes, that was absolutely the right thing to do, this is good stuff?
I mean, if you ask anyone who is any kind of political figure who's been elected, I'm not elected into this role, but I was elected as a councillor, if they want to be able to do more to help improve the communities that they represent, then everyone would say yes. I don't think there's anyone from any political persuasion who doesn't want to make their places better. That's why they're stepping into these kinds of roles in the first place. So we all want to do our very best for our communities, and these roles, this role through the combined authority, and certainly in this role as Deputy Mayor for Police, Fire and Crime, is an opportunity to do that. It's a huge honour to be in a position where you can work alongside the police officers and the firefighters, who are also operationally, working tirelessly all the time to keep communities safe. And so absolutely, I would say this is a fantastic role in order to be able to kind of scrutinise those and make sure that those services are operating to the best of their abilities to keep people safe and looking for opportunities to do things even better is fantastic. Was doing that earlier today with conversations about police colleagues, about CCTV, and with fire colleagues talking about whether or not we can get workspaces into some of our fire stations. Those are brilliant things to be able to do for your community. So no, absolutely, it's an amazing thing. And like I said at the beginning, devolution is about looking after your place. And I think, anyone who's going into public life wants to do best for their place at whatever level they're operating. The Home Secretary is looking after her place in a wider sense than I am, but actually both of those jobs, for that place are really important. And I want to do my bit for my local place, just as I'm sure the Home Secretary is doing her best for the wider United Kingdom place. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a huge role, and I can hear the enthusiasm in your voice and the honour that you feel doing it, which is fantastic to hear. So bearing all that in mind, I ask you my final and probably most difficult question, which is if I was to ask you to give one piece of advice to our podcast listeners about what they should go away and think about now they've just listened to you for half an hour and me asking you a few questions, what would you like them to go away and think about? What's the one thing? You've used the word place many, many times. I wonder if that's going to be in your answer, but what would that be?
I'm going to try not to say that in my answer. I was actually going to my challenge, I suppose, would be to try and work out how you can be proactive at a time when services are really stretched. So I know that every blue light service is under incredible pressure. Budgets are really tight. I had a meeting with the Yorkshire Ambulance Service a couple of weeks ago just to talk about how we might improve our collaboration there, particularly in our rural communities. So I think that trying to get into a proactive space when services are really stretched is really difficult. But I think if we think about that, so two of our priorities, one in the police plan and one in the fire plan, is around prevention and early intervention. So I think my challenge to everyone would be what can you do around prevention and early intervention, and how can you work collaboratively with other partners to make that happen? And if me in my role can help to do some of that for my place, so York and North Yorkshire, then that's certainly my focus. I think it's really difficult when things are difficult, so when budgets are stretched and when demand is high, I think that is really hard. And I do think devolution gives us an opportunity to do more of that, which is certainly what I'm focused on, what the Mayor is focused on through the priorities that we've set for the police and crime plan and the fire and rescue plan. But certainly that's what I would urge people to do, is to try and think about what they can be doing to focus more on prevention and early intervention, and what questions they need to ask to who to make that happen. Because obviously for a lot of people they won't be able to do that, but other people will.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. That's a great piece of advice for our listeners, all about prevention. So what a great conversation. Thank you so much, Jo, for spending time with me today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you ever so much, Catherine.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Tom St. John for expertly producing this episode. If you like this episode, then be sure to check out other conversations with leaders in this season of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new episodes from us here at Emergency Services Times.